Hello, and welcome to Section 2, The Quality of Pedagogical Wisdom. That includes Chapter 3, Pedagogical Wisdom, and Chapter 4, Balancing with Pedagogical Wisdom. To join our presentation via Nearpod, please visit join.nearpod.com and enter the Nearpod join code TMEFK. My name is Carly Bird, and today I'm going to be presenting to you Chapter 3, Pedagogical Wisdom, Teaching as Improvisation. Let's begin with a reflection. As I reflect on my experiences as a student, learner, teacher, what pedagogical moments come to mind? I'd also like to start us out with a quote from Alan Alda, who is known for his work as Hawkeye Pierce in MASH and later as a communication expert who uses improvisation to foster the pedagogical moment. Listening is not just waiting for you to finish talking, which comes from Alan Alda's books. If I understood you, would I have this look on my face? But let's start off with what is a pedagogical moment. A pedagogical moment is a teachable moment with intentionality and reflection. These are those big aha moments that you have during a lesson. It's those times when you as the presenter or teacher are learning as much as your audience. And I want to illustrate that with a personal experience. I was teaching a great novel to my fourth grade students because of Winn-Dixie. And within that novel, there's a character named Otis who is discriminated against or is treated differently because he's been to jail before. One of my students jumps up and shares that his mother had been to jail. Now, this was a pedagogical moment because it was a moment when I could turn my lesson in a different direction, and I knew that there had to be some kind of specialized answer. What's important about improvising in pedagogical moments is the opportunities it affords us as scholar practitioners. Now, there are a couple of things you need to focus on when you're thinking about pedagogical moments. You need to be open for reciprocal listening. You need to be present in the moment and be ready to discern the meaning in complex situations. Let's go back to my personal example to talk a little bit more about that. As that student shared that his parent had been to jail before, I had to kind of decide, was I going to continue with my lesson as I had written it with my script, or was I going to improvise? Instead of rushing through, we talked about the nature of trust and how in order to have it, first you must give it. The idea of trust not being possible until you give it is nothing that I had planned to teach, just as I had not planned to have the student share about his mom. That idea is really paradoxical. My students completely understood it, and I reflected later what deep metacognition my 9-year-old students just experienced. How does a pedagogical moment reflect improvisation? Well, what does it look like in a teachable moment? It follows a certain set of rules, but it always includes these descriptions. All the parties are engaged. The answers are intentional and ethical, because not only are we thinking about the content of what we're saying, but we have to be considering the causes and the effects of what we're saying on our students. But sometimes you can only discover the effect of improvisation on a pedagogical moment via reflection. Let's take a quick poll. Let's see how your classroom reflects improvisation. Reflecting on your own practice, have you noticed pedagogical moments that were based in improvisation? Choose as many as apply to your practice. Would they apply to A, the topic you were teaching, B, how to deal with an unexpected question, C, the name of a student you forgot, or D, I never improvise. Everything goes according to plan for me. All right, I'm going to turn this right over to Brenda.
Thank you, Carly. My name is Brenda Ayala, and I'm going to continue with Chapter 3. So now let's consider the following thought. What do you think characterizes your pedagogical repertoire? Could it be your content knowledge, or maybe all the different strategies you use to teach something? When I think of the meaning of a repertoire, the first thing that comes to mind is a set of music. Like a singer, including songs from his or her repertoire in a concert. Let's think now on what do you bring to your performance, to your pedagogical practice. Well, my repertoire includes my content knowledge, the learning strategies that I have acquired during the years, and even the different sets of skills acquired from my business and management background. All of that I can apply to my classroom community. Carly, next, please. Now think of what the word repertoire means to you. Could it be a list of musical pieces, or a compilation of skills, or just a bag of tricks? As scholar practitioners, our repertoire should have all the skills that we bring into our practice. These are not only our content-based, but also the aspects of classroom management. How do we deal with social emotional learning? And even how do we communicate to others that in order for us to be that teacher in our classroom. Next, please. During the next sets of slides, we are going to reflect on how do each one of us characterize our pedagogical repertoire, which we use during pedagogical moments, as Carly just explained. Next. Now, on chapter 3, our authors express that we need to cultivate a capacity for pedagogical wisdom. They indicate that we teach who we are. So that means that we bring our own set of elements that influence how do we teach. That means that we need to understand our I, since understanding ourselves, that will be the wellspring of wisdom that will emanate. And we need to cultivate these aspects, since if we don't understand them, it could be catastrophic. Not being able to do so can affect the way we do things as educators, since we might supersede our emotions and beliefs over our students, and that will not make us advocates for our student, which is our most important aspect in our job, being advocates for them. Being their advocates, doing this can result in those catastrophic moments if we don't are able to touch their lives in a positive way. It could have negative repercussions. As scholar practitioners, we need to have an open mind and an open heart to make ourselves vulnerable and willing to question ourselves and become the learner, become the student. Be curious, attentive, and aware. That will help us recognize those teachable moments that will allow us to draw forward into in order to address different moments. How could we say something different, or maybe become more empathetic upon a situation? This reminds me of my first year of teaching, where one of my students was very conscious about his stuttering. And I was just sponge myself. I was a learner myself. My first year, I could learn from anything and anybody. And even from a show, I was watching one night American Idol, and teachers, we don't stop in teaching, even if we're not in the classroom. So I'm looking at the show, and this participant explained how much he used to stutter, but music saved his life. I saved the clip of the video. I went back to my classroom and I show it to my student, not only being able to help him at that moment, but to connect with him from that day forward. I took a moment as a learner to be a learning for myself in order to better serve my student. Carly, next, please. Now, by cultivating this pedagogical wisdoms is collecting our learning moments, starting to creating a repertoire of skills that can be used to better support the telos of education. And telos comes from a Greek word that actually means lead forward. So we are leading forward to the fullest realization of their individual potential in each one of our students. So by developing this repertoire, we collect the knowledge that will help us provide different responses to maybe the same situation, but to different students, to different parents, simplifying our communication and making it more manageable and clarifying misconceptions. By doing so, we connect with our students in a way that we comply with our obligation of providing knowledge, but at the same time nurture a sense of wonder and curiosity, creating a safe environment for our scholars where relations are the key. and we will be able to communicate better. And because communication will be better, then our relationship will be stronger and more long lasting. So let's go back to our original question. Thank you, Carly. Now take a moment to reflect on your own repertoire. What do you think characterize the pedagogical repertoire upon which you can draw during those pedagogical moments? With that being said, Margaret?
Thanks. Okay, so I'm Margaret Bloodworth, and I'm going to start us off on chapter 4. And so what I want you to do is, as we start chapter 4, I want you to just reflect and think about the questions that are evoked by the ideas that you hear in this chapter, and where do those questions fit within your plan for learning. So most of us work in education know how crucial differentiation of instruction is for success of teaching and learning. So things like MTSS, formerly RTI, PLCs, all of that sounds very familiar to most of you. I just wanted to start off, I believe in humor, and so I wanted to start off with this funny video. Take a moment to watch it. It's just a fellow educator giving us another idea for additional ways that we can differentiate in our lives. So it's just a fun way to prime you for what's ahead in this chapter. We're going to start off with pressure points and differentials in engagement. So our chapter starts to discuss differentials and engagement, and it reminds us that there are so many levels of engagement and how it's our job as a scholar practitioner to balance all of those levels, from those who are ready to engage and those who are not, all of those levels within our classrooms. A theme that continues throughout this chapter with stories of how teachers have found ways to connect with their students and form meaningful relationships really helps to foster the authentic engagement. And that reminds me of a student that I had for several years. I worked as an educational diagnostician, and my office is located right next to the principal's office. So I often see and interact with some of the students who come to cool down, who require some additional discipline and support. And there was this one particular student, starting off when he was in first grade, who had a hard home life. He really struggled and did not receive a lot of attention, and just a lot of socioeconomic issues for him. One of his siblings was on my caseload, and so one day the principal needed some help, and so she asked if he could sit in my office just so eyes could be on him. And you know, I believe in the all-in mentality, and while he's not one of my students, I absolutely said yes. So he came and sat in my office, and I engaged in conversation with him. And he talked a lot to me. So we talked a lot about, you know, his life and his likes and dislikes. And, you know, I really made it a point after that time, anytime he was in the office, to talk to him and to, you know, seek him out a little bit if it was in the hall, and just kind of make deposits with him. I wanted him to know that somebody cared. And for him to find some connection with adults. When he would get really out of control, or if I walked in the office and he was in there and really struggling, he would always be able to respond well to me, and then kind of go back and reflect on his behaviors. So it was that connection and relationship that I built with him that allowed him to trust me and want to make better choices. So I was able to share with his teachers from year to year about relationships and how important that was to help foster that authentic engagement for him in the classroom. And so that was just a moment that just shows how much connection matters. And I was able to watch him go from 1st through 5th grade this year when he's moving to middle school, and his growth. And it was pretty exciting. So you can see in that graph below, it just is components of the educational endeavors, and it really is just illustrating how important and equal all 3 components are. And it continues in a cycle over and over again as we're going throughout our education. And so the next slide is going to talk about, we're going to talk about another pressure point, and that's the disconnections between teaching and learning. So this point really touches on how we have shifted from instructional objectives to learning objectives. So instead of, this is what I'm going to teach, now we're looking at, this is what the students are going to learn. And that's considered the behavior objective movement. And that's come around in the 20th century, and it's focusing on what our students should learn, and it really gives them a clear understanding of expectations for learning and more responsibility and control in their learning. And so even with this shift, what we're still seeing is a gap in our students' learning. So many of those skills that we teach in the classroom have these prerequisite sub-objectives that need to be mastered first. And this is a continued disconnect between what we're teaching and what our students are actually learning. So as scholar practitioners, we have to be able to acknowledge and value all of those different individual variations with learning and mind the gap. And that comes straight from the book. Mind the gap that's there, and then monitor what students are actually taking away. As I said earlier, I'm a diagnostician, and so I see this quite a bit in my field as we meet as an art committee yearly to review progress, to determine needed changes for an IEP. So when we come to those ARDs, as I'm sure many of you have said in before, I have recently noticed a trend of students not mastering goals. And it's because they're still missing some of those sub-objectives, some of those prerequisite objectives. And it's my hope as I become a scholar practitioner that I can help with this issue and help be a part of that solution and help mind the gap that so many of our students continue to experience. I'm going to end my part of this presentation with some open-ended questions. So in the beginning, I asked you to reflect and think about some questions that would come up as we go through, this part of the chapter. And so now I want you to think about, these are the questions that came to me. And so I'm going to pose these to you now and ask that you take a minute to respond in the text box and let us know some of your thoughts. So what I was thinking through is, what are some ways that you as a scholar practitioner manage the difference in engagement? And then I want you to think about how you build relationships and connections with your students. And so how do those connections facilitate authentic engagement? And in what way is your campus or district minding the gap between what you want students to learn and what they're actually learning? So our district has PLCs, those professional learning communities, and that is a great way for teachers to get together to work on minding that gap, to see where that is, to get that intervention in place for students. So we're curious of what are some ways that you guys are doing that in your district. So I'm gonna pass this on to Jackie.
Thank you, Carly, Brenda, and Margaret. My name is Jackie Bennett. I'll be continuing in Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is titled Balancing with Pedagogical Wisdom. There are 4 pressure points listed that highlight the challenges to this delicate balance. The reflective question is, the next few slides we'll consider is, what thoughts and feelings are evoked by the ideas in this chapter? Next slide, please. So we'll start with the teacher focus. The third pressure point in Chapter 4 is modes of learning and modes of teaching. And this section discusses how all students have individual learning styles. For my slides, scholar practitioner can be substituted for teachers, so you can just kind of assume that's what I mean if I don't say so. Teachers have learning styles that may influence how they teach. The authors question, how does a teacher determine what styles to teach when developing a class? Is a teacher responsible for developing a different individual learning plan for every student? And the answer is yes, but this can lead to disaster and burnout for the teacher, and it's not feasible. In my experience as an instructor in a healthcare profession program, I've learned that developing pedagogical wisdom to address this important point must include a balance of 1, engaging each student, 2, taking inventory of the learning styles of all the students, 3, developing a class that can teach to all the blends of styles, and assessing the learning taking place through embedded assessments. I've also learned that students influence each other in how they learn, and each class is unique. I have to tailor every course for each cohort, unique for their unique learning styles. Next slide, please. The other thing to consider is the student focus. The authors challenge us to consider, how do we know that a student is fully engaged in learning? How do we assess the learning style of each student? Can taking inventory cause biases or cause us to avoid teaching to a particular style because of prejudices? How do we assess that learning is taking place? This leads to the 4th pressure point, measurement mania. There's so many things that can be measured, but how do we employ pedagogical wisdom to assess the areas that matter and that can accurately assess the targeted learning is happening? How do we avoid grade inflation? How do we separate the excelling students from the students who are struggling? Pre and post assessments can be helpful, but what should be done with the information gathered from these assessments? The chapter states that when assessments occur within the process, scholar practitioners can skillfully help the students determine for themselves how much they are learning. This can also foster communication between the scholar practitioner and the students to determine what learning has taken place and what needs to be done to fill the gap so important concepts are achieved. In my experience, taking inventory of the students' learning styles can help me tweak my delivery to reach each student at some level. I've also learned that assessments can quickly help to assess what is working and what is not, so changes can be made quickly. Next slide, please. So this is just a graph showing the difference, the teacher responsibility and the student responsibility. So where does the responsibility for learning fall? And the answer is both. However, I offer that the main responsibility falls on the teacher because the teacher is the content expert and knows what the students need to learn. They should have the pedagogical wisdom to know how to engage the student and deliver the material in a way that teaches to the student's strength, and they can gauge this with appropriate embedded assessments. However, if a student chooses not to engage due to lack of motivation or life circumstances, there's only so far that a teacher can go. Therefore, it takes a delicate balance of pedagogical wisdom, as the title suggests. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk about inventories. There are several types of inventories to establish learning styles: the Myers-Briggs typology, external internal locus of control, and auditory visual kinesthetic are a few that the chapter describes. What is a potential danger for instituting curriculum changes based on taking these inventories? So the 3 I detail are not positive. And taking inventory can be positive, but you have to be careful. But that one of these is more dangerous than the others. So taking an inventory can be used to determine if students should be allowed in a class or not. It can label or put students in a box, leading to screening of applicants to match the teaching style of the instructor. And it can be used to count students for a class. Well, I offer that A is pretty dangerous because taking inventory should not exclude students. Next slide, please. So this is our reference page. If you have any questions, please direct them to the discussion forum. And thank you so much for listening to our video presentation.